Joining me on our news panel are Paul Rogers, San Jose Mercury News environment writer; Mark Purdy, sports columnist also with the San Jose Mercury News; and John Myers, KQED News Sacramento bureau chief. John, with the cuts in the millions instead of the billions, who will be hurt the most by this?
Well, if you look at the automatic trigger cuts, and we should call them automatic because they were built into the budget last year. The governor just announced revenue numbers this week. He didn't actually cut it himself. If you look at that $980 million, roughly 2/3 of it, I think you would call students and the disabled. Students in terms of higher education, UC, CSU, additional cuts, which is hard to believe for those folks. Busing and transportation for K through 12 schools. In-home support services and developmentally disabled services also taking the big cuts there. But the real question, I think, out of these BELVA, well, two real questions. One is, do all the cuts actually happen? There are court cases that are challenging some of them. The in-home support care is on a temporary block by a judge. The folks at LA Unified down in Southern California are going to sue over the transportation cuts. And then what comes after that in January? This is not the end of the cutting, and the governor said that on Tuesday in a press conference at the Capitol. There's more cutting to come.
But if there's no money, what good the lawsuits?
Well, that would be, if only that would stop the lawsuits. I mean, lawsuits have become as much of the budget process as negotiations and gimmicks and things like that, because as we have seen through the years, more and more of the budget is off limits for legislators to actually manipulate, whether it's by voter initiative, whether it's by standards that are put in federal law, state law. And a lot of times you will hear lawmakers and staff at the state capitol say, well, we're going to write this in. It may not stand in the courts, but if it doesn't, we'll come back next year and try to figure it out. And therein lies another part of that saga, that we really don't have a firm budget solution, and we haven't had for a long time.
Well, cast this forward. So when Jerry Brown took office a year ago, we had a $27 billion deficit. He's got it down to about 13 right now. So he's cut it roughly in half. And he's talking about a tax measure for the summer, which might knock another 7 off it. But how's he going to get the remaining 6 or 7? It's still not balanced, even if voters approve new taxes in November.
Yeah, well, the tax measure will be in November, not the summer, but yeah, still. So he thinks, and we'll see the budget on January 10th, but he kind of previewed it a little bit this week. We think the rest is cuts. The question is, if it's about $4, $5, $6 billion in cuts, where does that come from? I mean, one of the questions he got at the press conference was, can you do this without cutting schools? He hedged, because schools is 40 to 45% of the budget, depending on how you count it. And the schools have taken a lot of cuts. There's talk about a shorter school year. Social services, again, would be on the chopping block. Again, there are very few places you can't touch. I get back to that being fascinating.
What were his other options? Did he have any other options? You see that every day. What is it?
There are so few options, especially when revenues are completely off the table. I mean, the great story of the first year of Jerry Brown's term in office is trying to find a way to bridge the partisan gap in Sacramento. He never found it. He joked this week that I'm not going to be pouring any more of my wine for Republicans and trying to convince them to vote for taxes. But he also has not found a long-term solution on some other issues with Democrats. Key to that would be public employee pensions and the cost of pensions, whether that's high or too high or about right. He hasn't found any agreement there yet. So I think the longer that this goes, the governor has to ultimately go back to the voters, and he has to say, look, I'm doing everything I can in Sacramento, but you have to ultimately decide what you want to do. You created a lot of these measures that protect school funding and property tax rates and all of that. You've got to decide what we're going to do with it. So,
well, Republicans say, though, that this is still a matter of spending rather than tax increases. And yet we're hearing about all of these very damaging cuts. How can they say that in light of the reality that the governor's presenting?
Well, I think two reasons I can say it. One, let's look back at the budget that was crafted in June. That budget, the Democratic legislative leaders and the governor were about $4 billion apart. The governor vetoed a budget, we'll remember, which was quite controversial to veto a Democratic budget. About 2 or 3 days later, they came back, they found $4 billion that they put into the revenue number. So if you're sitting on the other side of the aisle, you go, well, those weren't real numbers. That's not real budgeting. Also, too, a lot of the solutions have been one-time. They have not been ongoing. And if you look at the reports we've gotten even last week from the state controller, expenses are coming in over what they're estimated to be. We're not cutting as much as we said we were going to cut. So I think if you're a Republican in the legislature, you believe that there's been no long-term systemic fix here. These have all been little things of the Democrats and their side not doing what they said they do. So that's why I say the governor has a problem on both sides of the aisle here. I do think the governor gets credit for being honest about the budget, with the exception of the $4 billion. He's been honest about the problem. But honesty about the problem and a couple of bucks will get you a cup of coffee. I mean, you got to find some way around that that gridlock.
Well, it may just be that he just keeps chipping away at it in hopes that the economy keeps slowly improving, so the tax revenue keeps going in, right? So it went 27 the first year, 13 the second. If he can get the taxes through, then it's 6 or 7. You know, he's shrinking the structural deficit, frankly, that Arnold created and Gray Davis before that created when Gray Davis overspent based on a tax revenue bubble, and then Arnold came in and immediately cut the car tax, right? So the last 2 governors just created this big unfixable $8 billion or so hole, and now Jerry's trying to slowly clean up the mess in a bad economy.
And a key issue to that, if I can point out really quickly, is Brown's idea for realigning services from the state to the local government. That takes money off of the state books. The taxes are linked somehow to that in the tax initiative. But as I've been told by a couple of people in local government, that process, public safety realignment, all this really starts to kick in when? In the fall of 2012, as the governor is on the campaign trail trying to get the taxes. So if there's a big problem at a county jail or something else, that's going to impact the campaign to get the money.
Don't you think he should do that? I mean, that's the way you're going to get it passed, right? I mean, I'm just a sports columnist, right? But I remember, you know, when I grown up in my hometown, and they'd have a school levy. And the surest way to get a positive vote on the school levy was say, we're going to cut sports, we're going to cut theater, all the stuff people really like out of the high school, and that got people on board, and they voted for it. What's the version of that in the state?
I will say that there's conflicting debate among political strategists right now, but one of the points is this past fall in November, we had local tax measures passing at a higher rate around California when they were earmarked to specific programs, and I think that's what the governor has to do, is he's got to show the money goes for things in your backyard.
Well, we're going to move now to a story where we know specifically what happened just a day or hours ago. So, Mark, explain to us what happened in resolving the Barry Bonds story.
Well, we're finally sort of at the end of all this. Barry Bonds was convicted last spring of obstruction of justice, and today he was sentenced. And Judge Susan Ilston, I was there in the courtroom, said that he would receive 30 days of home confinement and $4,000 fine, 250 days of community service, and I think he has to write on the blackboard 1,000 times, I will not be a smart aleck to the grand jury. No. The prosecutor called it a slap on the wrist. I guess it kind of sort of was, but he is a felon. He will be a felon unless the conviction is overturned on appeal, and his attorneys have said they will file for appeal. Meanwhile, he got to go home tonight, and he was at home, but he wasn't confined at home.
And that's, I mean, this whole notion of the appeal and the push for as light a thing possible. I mean, he's got his eye toward history there, it would seem like, right?
You know, he really does care. That's what, you know, we've learned a lot of things in this trial, and one was Barry, after all those years, and I covered him, he seemed, I don't care about my image, I don't care what you guys think. He really does care about his image. Otherwise, there's no way he would appeal this, there's no way he would, I mean, because 30 days of home confinement, he could have this out of the way by springtime and he's on with it, but he really cares about his image, and he somehow believes that if he can wipe out this felony conviction, that it will improve his image to such that he would be electable to the Baseball Hall of Fame.
Do you think it can? I mean,
I am a Baseball Hall of Fame voter, and someone asked me that today, and you're asking me that. I'm not. It doesn't really factor in my Hall of Fame voting. That's why I think Barry's got this a little bit wrong. The guys I know that vote, and women I know that vote, are thinking, they're not concerned about felony conviction. They're concerned about, did he use steroids? And this was just about obstruction of justice. It wasn't, did he use steroids or not? And I don't think it's going to have that big an effect on the way people vote. And I think right now, you know, the inclination would be not to vote for him. Mark McGwire's been on the ballot. The Baseball Hall of Fame ballot works in an interesting way. I just received mine this week. You have a list of guys who are eligible after they're done playing for 5 years, but they stay on the ballot. If they aren't elected the first year, they stay on the ballot for as many as 14 more years. My feeling about this is that I'm going to wait as long as I can to kind of get a view of the baseball landscape. If it turns out 80% of the people were using steroids, well, then it was a level playing field, and I can feel better about voting for something like that. But right now, the frustrating part for me about this trial is that we didn't trials are supposed to be about learning the truth, right? And the truth was never really discussed in this. It was all these legal games about, did Barry mean this when he said that? And
But we already kind of know the truth, right? I mean, Victor Conte went to jail for steroids crimes, and in Victor Conte's lab were records that had the initials BLB, Barry Lamar Bonds. I mean, there is a long, long list of very, very call it circumstantial, call it whatever you want, but it's pretty hard to explain away using common sense. And I guess the question I'm curious about is, knowing that he faced actual jail today, what was the scene like in the court? I mean, what did Barry look like? How was his behavior today?
You know, first of all, he looks a lot thinner than he was. Even last spring during the trial itself, he looks in great shape that way. I was there when he walked in the court. He strutted, his Barry kind of saunter strut when he walked in the courtroom. But when he sat at the defense table, you know, he kind of put his hand on his chin. He was a little fit. You could tell he was a little uneasy. Then his lawyers came in and talked to him, and he felt better. I think they all knew he probably wasn't going to go to jail. And then he kind of kept a straight face through the whole thing. He only said 3 words. Judge Susan Ilston asked him, have you read all the paperwork in this case? And he said yes. I don't know if I believe that, but he did. He said yes. And then she asked him, do you have anything to say? And he said, no, ma'am. And I guess if I had a wish, it would be that when she asked him that question, he would have said, you know, I do have something to say. Let me tell you what really happened. But he wasn't going to do that. The attorney said, don't do that, so he didn't do that.
Well, what we have to move to now are stadiums for guys like Barry to play in.
Yeah.
Now, there's a lot of playing going on around about the stadiums in the major cities in our area.
Yeah. And, you know, it's really... That's kind of the biggest story in sports right now in the Bay Area to me, is where all these teams are going to end up playing. It's shuffling around, and I'm most interested in how the A's situation is going to play out. But I know most fans, there are more football fans than anything, are really wondering about the 49ers situation, and that's been a real eye-opener for me in this standpoint. I wasn't exactly sure how Jed York, this 30-year-old guy, was going to be able to pull things together. He's done a remarkable job, and when he got these banks now to loan him $850 million, I don't know, 30-year-old guy walks in and cuts that deal. That's very impressive, and I think they're about 75% of the way there to Santa Clara.
Here's the question a lot of San Francisco 49ers fans who live in San Francisco have. Is there any way to undo this now? The Santa Clara City Council voted unanimously for it. They've got money from Goldman Sachs.
Right.
Is there any way at this point that San Francisco can stop the team from leaving?
No, there's no way San Francisco can stop it if the deal goes through.
Do you think the deal's a done deal?
I don't think it's a total done deal, no. I will believe it's a done deal when they announce the naming rights sponsor. If they get the naming rights sponsor, because you're talking 150, 200, you know, a lot of money there. If they get that, the NFL's committed 150 million. They've got this loan money. Then it's a done deal. And the other thing that would convince me is if the Raiders come in on it, which is another issue. To share. Well, I don't think the Raiders will come in on a deal to share. I think they would agree to lease it for 10 years.
And what do you think, just quickly, since you said you're really fascinated with the A's, what do you see that standing right now about the possibilities or percentages, if you wanted to put it on?
You know, I said the 49ers are about 75% of the way to Santa Clara. The A's are maybe 51% of the way to San Jose. That's tied up. It's a whole bunch of moving parts. The Giants have claimed the territorial rights to the South Bay. That can be overturned by a 75% vote of the baseball owners. There's a lot of activity around that. It's my understanding the baseball officials have been in San Jose talking to the mayor within the last month. The owners have a meeting in Arizona next month, and I think that's going to be a serious topic of conversation. And if they take a vote and it's 75% for the A's, then the owners of the A's, Lou Wolf and David Fisher, can investigate building a ballpark.
Well, we have to move now to a place where there was some action. Congress did something. They passed a new gas pipeline safety bill. Does it do enough?
Well, what happened this week was the House and Senate voted for a bill that is now on President Obama's desk that came in response to the San Bruno pipeline explosion from September of 2010. I think a lot of pipeline safety people would tell you, no, it doesn't do enough, because the thing that the authors of the bill, Bud Schuster, Republican for Pennsylvania, would tell you is this doubles the fines for pipeline operators that have safety problems. This puts more money for federal inspectors inspectors out there. This requires more of the high-quality pressure testing where they put water through the pipe at a higher pressure than the gas, so if the water leaks, they know that they have to fix the pipe so it doesn't blow up more neighborhoods. But in the end, one of the central takeaways here is that when the experts, the inspectors from the National Transportation Safety Board flew out here, pulled up the pipe, flew it back to Washington, looked at it with electron microscopes, went through literally hundreds of thousands of pages of records, one of their main recommendations at the end was you need to have automatic shutoff valves on these pipes all over the country. There's 2 million miles of these natural gas transmission lines. They run under our homes, under our schools, under our streets. Some of them are 100 years old. They're not inspected very well. And basically, when you have one break, like in San Bruno, the gas just keeps flowing at incredible pressure. And as we remember in San Bruno, the firemen couldn't even get close to it because it was 100 foot high and it poured out for 90 minutes. And a lot of the people who died and whose homes were destroyed might not have suffered as badly. And the NTSB actually found that had they had these automatic shutoff valves which shut when the pressure of the pipe goes down, it probably would have only burned for 15 minutes. So Jackie Speer, the congresswoman from around here, introduced a bill that would require these valves on all the old pipes in neighborhoods where there's a lot of people and near earthquake areas, earthquake risk areas. The pipeline industry did not want that. It cost too much money. So they worked on the Republicans in the House, and the language of the bill says you put these shutoff valves only on new pipes and only, quote, where economically feasible. So you can imagine how many of these. None. So the whole thing, in the large part, is window dressing. But the good news for Californians is, as usual, California has passed stricter safety rules than the rest of the country. Jerry Brown signed a law in October that authorizes the PUC to require these kind of valves, and PG&E is already putting them in. PG&E is putting in 220 of them. They're expensive. They're hundreds of thousands of dollars.
For the whole state. I mean, that's a huge.
Well, do we end up paying for those, though?
Yes.
Will our bills go up?
Yes, and that's really where the whole thing has pivoted. Now, PG&E has done a lot, and you could argue under great pressure, to improve the safety of the gas lines. They've hired 200 new gas inspectors. They've pressure tested with water 150 miles of these pipes in the Bay Area. Our gas system in the Bay Area is a lot safer now than it was a year ago. But they got a lot more work to do. It's $2 billion, and they want you and me, the ratepayers, to pay 90% of that.
We have just a few seconds left.
Yes.
Paul, PG&E made an announcement this week.
Yeah.
Tell us what they said.
They admitted in court liability for the explosion. Now, that was sort of a fait accompli. We know, and I have reported and others have reported, they put the pipe in the ground in 1956. It wasn't some third-party contractor. They did it. But the judge asked them, they filed the paperwork, and they have admitted it. Some lawyers are saying the way they did it still leaves them some loopholes, so they can maybe blame the manufacturer of the pipe or something like that.
But they would never do that.
Never. And I'll tell you, though, they are facing, they have 100 lawsuits and maybe $1 billion or more liability. This is expensive.
More to come.
Well, more to come on that.
We'll be talking about this a year from now.
Okay, and I believe you. Thank you, Paul. In fact, thanks to all of you for joining me here tonight.